In terms of his influence, Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the most important philosophers of the 19th century. He was a major influence on Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, and Freud, to name a few. But who was he? He was born in 1788 and lived until 1860. He was the son of a wealthy merchant, and his mother was a famous novelist in her own right. Despite the fact that she introduced him to some of the most important people in Europe and thereby advanced his career, Schopenhauer never got along with her very well. And some people speculate that some of his misogynistic comments have much to do with his particular relationship to his mother. It wasn't his mother alone, however, that he didn't get along with. He was notoriously a contrarian. So much so that despite the fact that he didn't hold an official university position, he nevertheless decided to teach at a university opposite Hegel, scheduling all of his classes exactly at the same time that Hegel did, thereby ensuring that he didn't have any of Hegel's students in his classes. What he actually ensured was that he had no students in his classes at all. Fortunately, he was independently wealthy, and perhaps this has something to do with the curmudgeonly stance that he affects throughout his writings. His major work followed his dissertation, which was based on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Indeed, that was its topic, and I'll be saying more about the principle of sufficient reason shortly. His major work itself was called The World as Will and Representation, and in it, it becomes obvious that Schopenhauer did at least admire three major thinkers through world civilization. The most important influence in terms of German philosophy was Immanuel Kant. Schopenhauer took over a number of Kantian ideas, turning them to his own uses and using Kant's basic scheme as an argument for pessimism, something it's hard to believe Kant would have been very happy about. His other major Western hero was Plato, who he sometimes calls the divine Plato. However, Schopenhauer is important precisely because he turned his sights beyond Western philosophy. He was probably the first major Western thinker to pay a lot of attention to Indian philosophy, and indeed some of his insights are drawn directly from Buddhism. So his third hero is the Buddha. And these three influences become, as I say, very important throughout The World as Will and Representation. Although that work went through a number of editions in his life, Schopenhauer mainly added to it in terms of further examples that would illustrate his points. And indeed, he takes some pride in one of the prefaces to a later edition saying, "I have changed nothing." According to Schopenhauer's scheme, the world has two aspects. His first statement opening the book is, "The world is my representation." What Schopenhauer means by that is that the world as we know it depends entirely on our consciousness. The world that we understand in our everyday sense is something that consciousness has to present to us. And as he puts it, the world hangs by a single thread, the consciousness in which it exists. In other words, there isn't a kind of reality that corresponds to the world that we think we know. Indeed, it's our own minds that give it the shape that it has. This was hardly a striking thing for Schopenhauer to say, in that Kant's own theory, which held that the formulating categories of our minds shape the world as we know it, had already managed to convince virtually everyone in Germany of the truth of that. So Schopenhauer was really just going along with the basic idea that was held by everyone of his generation. However, what he chooses to do with this is really quite striking. For him, however, this basic point that the world is my representation simply meant he was an idealist, not a realist, that the world as we see it is something that's a function of the way our minds put it together. Consciousness and matter, then, as he puts it, are direct correlates. In other words, they're the framework on which everything that we come to know is constructed. However, the world that we come to know from his point of view is distorted in certain ways. His claim is that ultimately Kant is right to say that there is a thing in itself, some reality that is over and above, and indeed the fundamental basis of the reality that we observe. This fundamental reality is, according to him, will. Schopenhauer talks about will as though it is a kind of unified, although self-contradictory, reality underneath everything. And it's somewhat difficult, I think, for us to grasp what he means when he claims that will is the fundamental reality behind rocks as well as ourselves. His suggestion, however, is that we introspect and notice that the self that appears to us, what makes us individually different from everything that we observe, is this kind of internal, passionate, driven self. And that, he claims, is the will. The rest of reality, if it has the same status that we individually do, must, from his point of view, essentially be will as well. So even though he isn't claiming that rocks and such are conscious, he is claiming that there's an inner side to them that is akin to the inner side of ourselves. And will is the term that he uses to explain this. Despite the fact that will is the fundamental reality, Schopenhauer is insistent that the phenomena, the things that we observe that will invents in a sense, are internally related to each other in a very orderly, if conflicted way. Each type of thing relates to every other type of thing, first of all, through the principle of sufficient reason. Schopenhauer's notion of the principle of sufficient reason he at one point characterizes as follows: every possible object stands in a necessary relationship to other objects, on the one hand as determined, on the other hand as determining. What this means is that, according to Schopenhauer, there is a sufficient reason in other things within phenomena for each particular thing. Nothing stands on its own, and indeed it's unthinkable without the entire rest of reality. That basic principle allows him a kind of way of explaining how the order that we observe and attempt to give some sense to ourselves through science comes about. There are necessary connections between various things in the world, and indeed one can go further than this and claim that there are various types of things that interrelate in an orderly fashion. Despite this, however, individual entities, according to Schopenhauer, tend to stand in a relationship toward each other that is anything but enjoyable. Essentially, everything within the world defends itself against other entities, feeds itself on other entities, and this basic interconnection or nexus in which all things are united is not something that gives joy or satisfaction to the individual entities. Most individual entities are in a pretty miserable condition, and I'll have more to say about that. This helps us, however, to see why it is that Plato plays such an important role for Schopenhauer. According to Schopenhauer, one of the most important things that Plato observed is that the apparent world is not the entirety of reality, that indeed there is a higher plane in which we can notice the prototypes on which individuals seem to be modeled. The realm of the forms, or as it's sometimes translated, Plato's ideas, are, according to Plato, the basic prototypes for each type of thing. And if you want to understand the way in which things in nature are organized or relate to one another, it makes sense to talk about natural kinds. So, for instance, some natural kinds biologically depend for their existence on a certain amount of air, a certain amount of water, and so on. And in particular, for Schopenhauer's points, they depend a lot on feeding on other kinds of beings. According to Plato, reason allows us to recognize that individual types of things are not unique, but instead are parts of natural kinds that can be explained in fairly orderly ways. And what's particularly important for Schopenhauer, this insight into the prototypes of things in the world allows us to lift our attention away from particular situations into a more universal plane. Plato's own view was that the wise would attend to the forms, paying more attention to the kinds of things and the universal principles that they could come to understand this way than they did particular practical details of their own situation. And Schopenhauer thought that was really the ideal thing for human beings to do as well. This brings us to the point of Schopenhauer's pessimism. Schopenhauer is notoriously pessimistic. Indeed, I think Schopenhauer's style of being a pessimist was more the style of a curmudgeon than the style of an extremely depressed individual. To give you an example, here's a line from Schopenhauer's major work. The life of every individual, viewed as a whole and in general, and when only its most significant features are emphasized, is really a tragedy. But gone through in detail, it has the character of a comedy. For the doings and worries of the day, the restless mockeries of the moment, the desires and fears of the week, the mishaps of every hour, are all brought about by chance that is always bent on some mischievous trick. They are nothing but scenes from a comedy. Thus, as if fate wished to add mockery to the misery of our existence, our life must contain all the woes of tragedy, and yet we cannot even assert the dignity of tragic characters, but in the broad detail of life are inevitably the foolish characters of a comedy. Now, I think in a way that's a rather funny, biting, almost satire about everyday life. Most of the times we would like to think of ourselves as tragic heroes, and indeed the serious vulnerabilities that we have, for example, the fact that we recognize that we're going to die, certainly give us warrant in wanting to look at ourselves that way. But nevertheless, if we think about the details that our lives are full, basically what we come to is a sitcom. Schopenhauer's whole theory of the will he sees as a basis for pessimism, not only about the glory or inglory of our everyday lives, but about our whole position in the scheme of things. Everything, according to Schopenhauer, everything that lives is troubled. This he takes over from the Buddha. And essentially what Schopenhauer does is re-argue for the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism with his own particular spin. The first of these, that life is troubled, is something that he thinks he has more than enough evidence for. But if his first edition doesn't provide enough, he provides several more editions of his own work, giving further examples of just how miserable the situation of most living things actually is. Human conflict in particular is evidence for this, but if one considers the food chain, the efforts of animals attempting to get back to a certain place in order to lay their eggs, and the crisis that is produced as a result, Schopenhauer thinks if you just look around, this principle is really quite evident. The solution to this, following the Buddha, he claims, is to recognize that this trouble is caused by selfish craving, by desire. Schopenhauer thinks because we're all phenomenal manifestations of will, that the reality that is behind us is always will, that essentially desire is something that is just part of our nature. So how do we overcome this? According to the Buddha, we overcome this by overcoming selfish desire. If one ceases to crave selfishly, then one ceases to have the trouble that comes from craving. Schopenhauer agrees with this, but already one can see, I think, that there's a real problem here. If what we essentially are is will, and the only way in order to overcome the crisis and troubles of life is to stop willing, what does one do? Well, his solution, his version of the fourth noble truth, is what one does is resign oneself, renounce the will. In a way, this sounds like a project that isn't going to be very easy, and indeed, to say it's easy is not something Schopenhauer would be willing to do. He claims that it's very rare for someone to renounce the will, but it actually has happened. It's happened in the case of saints of really all traditions. What a saint does is recognize that there is no gain to be had in craving things selfishly against other beings. So being in competition, as most human beings are, is, according to Schopenhauer, something that we're driven to by the will, but won't advance us at all. If one really understands this, he claims, in other words, if one takes this to heart and doesn't just see it as an intellectual point, what that will do is undercut the motivation to keep struggling, to keep trying to end up finding what we think we want, because in fact nothing is really going to satisfy us. And in fact, some of the claims that Schopenhauer makes that add fuel to his pessimistic case, he thinks are good reasons to, in a sense, attempt this renunciation of the will. Though obviously there is a paradox. You can't really attempt very hard. You can't try to renounce the will in order not to suffer, because if you try very hard, you're just adding to your own willfulness, directing it in a different direction. So what usually is required in order to become a saint is not really trying hard not to will, which is self-defeating, but instead to basically reduce your desire to will by various kind of ascetic practices. So when saints of some traditions fast, for example, what they do is basically undercut the strength of the physical objectification of the will in ourselves, namely our bodies. By undercutting a certain kind of vitality of the body, there's less energy, in a sense, put into the whole project of willing. And that's what's reasonable in the case of these various traditions about ascetic practices. Bertrand Russell points out that it's a bit ironic for Schopenhauer, of all people, to be making this case, because in fact he was very far from an ascetic himself. Not only did he have a lot of fairly passionate love affairs, but he also, as Russell puts it, dined regularly at a fine restaurant. So one wonders whether or not Schopenhauer is the best person to be offering this kind of solution. Indeed, Schopenhauer didn't claim to be someone who himself succeeded at sanctity, though he thought it was a good idea. He recognizes that most people are not going to end up being saints, and as a matter of fact, he ends up sort of succinctly claiming the life of human beings and animals swings like a pendulum to and fro between pain and boredom, and these two are, in fact, its ultimate constituents. So from his point of view, his own situation is really just an illustration. Despite the fact that he's perhaps an exceptionally willful individual, he thinks it's only a question of degree, that basically he's fairly representative of the human kind. So if most people are not going to take the route of sanctity, are not going to subject themselves to ascetic practices, what is the solution? Well, the solution is something that's really temporary for most people, but this does explain why Schopenhauer places such an important role, or gives such important emphasis to ascetic experience in his own situation and that of others. Aesthetic experience, as opposed to ascetic practices, is the kind of experience one has in connection with beauty, with art. In fact, a whole quarter of Schopenhauer's book is devoted to the nature of aesthetic experience. The aesthetic experience, from his point of view, is the Sabbath from the penal servitude of willing. What does he believe? Well, basically, his claim is that in the aesthetic, we take joy in simple appearances. We can enjoy, for instance, the beauty of a sunset or the beauty of the lines of a mountain. And when we do that, we're not in our usual mode of practical willing. In other words, when we look at the sunset, we aren't somehow coming up with an agenda in which that sunset plays a role. We aren't thinking, how can this advantage me? Or is this interfering with me in some way? The attitudes he thinks we take most of the time toward virtually everything. Instead, we simply enjoy contemplating it for its own sake. And in that condition, according to Schopenhauer, the individual becomes, as he puts it, the pure will-less subject of intellect. The pure will-less subject here being the self, but the self without practical consideration. One becomes pure, or in a sense, a universal manifestation of human intelligence when one contemplates the sunset. In this respect, he is following Kant more or less, for Kant claimed that what we enjoy in aesthetic experience is really the intellectual faculties of our own mind, and they have a certain kind of pleasure in simply contemplating, precisely because this situation is divorced from practical agendas of any sort. So for Schopenhauer, following Kant, the mind becomes pure and will-less. Essentially, as long as we're enjoying contemplating, we're ignoring the kind of usual pressures of the day that require us to work for a living and so on. At the same time, the object that we contemplate also undergoes a kind of transformation toward universality. We start to see the object not as this specific thing in front of us, not as this or that particular tree with a particular set of needs, but instead an instance of the universal. We're lifted from the everyday world to the realm of Platonic ideas. And accordingly, what happens is that the whole operation of contemplating is a matter of seeing the universal on both ends of the subject-object relationship. The subject is now a universal manifestation of human intellect, devoid of will, and the object itself is a manifestation of the universal type of thing. So, according to Schopenhauer in one passage, it doesn't matter whether the beautiful tree we contemplate is the one here in front of us now or one that bloomed 1,000 years ago. Essentially, it's the same experience. Schopenhauer thinks this has a kind of spiritual importance because it really gives us a glimpse of the true nature of things. Most of the time, we're caught up in the pragmatics of our relationship to individual things around us. Either these things are things that we want or things that we want to be removed from. Other individuals are either people that can help us, people that we want to associate with, or people that are hindering us in some way. And the consequence of all of this, according to Schopenhauer, is that there's essentially a continual struggle among human beings. It is, as Hobbes puts it, a war of all against all. However, in the case of the arts and in the case of aesthetic experience of nature, what we do is drop all of that for the time being. Simply enjoy reality as a human being in this particular shape of the Platonic idea. According to Schopenhauer, the Platonic idea is a mode of the will's objectification, as he puts it, but in its finest form. In other words, the will manifests itself according to natural kinds, as I've mentioned before. There are types of things that the will has chosen to, in a sense, invent for our intellectual entertainment, in effect. But at the same time, these types of things are full manifestations of the will in a complete form or in a perfect form only in the idea. What he has in mind here is basically Plato's point that most of the things around us are not perfect instances of their type. Deterioration happens even when something is well made. Many things are flawed. Individual details that differentiate one particular from another are not really essential to manifesting the will at this particular grade, as Schopenhauer describes it. But when we have an aesthetic experience, we see beyond any flaws of this particular instance and recognize the universal. The closest we can get to a pure understanding of the fundamental reality through art, however, is not the visual arts, which Schopenhauer assumes are representational. So he basically assumes that, for instance, a painting would be providing us with a kind of insight into the Platonic idea of a tree, if it's a painting of a tree, just as the tree itself, in effect, provides us with insight into that when we contemplate it aesthetically. But because the visual arts in this way always refer to a particular kind of thing, they still don't quite give us insight into the will directly. Only music does that, according to Schopenhauer. The explanation for this has much to do with his general view that the arts on the whole tend to deal with representations of things, whereas music doesn't seem to be representing anything. One might, for instance, accept architecture by suggesting that it doesn't seem that architecture generally represents anything either. But according to Schopenhauer, it does draw our attention to certain fundamental grades of the will's objectification, in this case, fundamental physical principles. So he would claim, for instance, that the rigidity of buildings is being imposed or presented in opposition to gravity. And so there is still a kind of direct reference to certain basic forms in which the will is manifest, namely these fundamental principles of physics. In music, however, we get something like the direct movements of the will. In other words, what Schopenhauer thinks happens is when we listen to music, we sense the kind of movements of will and desire without any particular example being given, as would be the case if it represented something. So, for instance, he claims that we have a very powerful emotional reaction because music so directly copies something like our basic emotional life. We hear music and we feel, in a sense, drawn to follow it with our will. This, according to Schopenhauer, music is basically a manifestation of the will directly. At one point, he even goes so far as to say that music is essentially the equivalent of the world, in that music presents a kind of adequate embodiment of the will, just as the world taken as a whole does. And he develops a whole series of very ingenious analogies between the great chain of being in the world and the various parts of music, though I think that the music of his own time is clearly the prototype for these images that he has in mind. Even though music he thinks is the most powerful of the aesthetic forms, even music is something that we can fundamentally get peace from only temporarily. No matter what degree of insight one has, one can still only contemplate art and the aesthetic for so long before one faces actual physical needs. Only the great saints of these various traditions of the world escape willing entirely. So while aesthetic experience does draw our attention away from our everyday needs and projects, this is something that's only going to be a temporary escape. By contrast, the great saints do succeed, according to Schopenhauer, in leaving behind the ordinary willfulness that is their natural condition. And Schopenhauer actually draws a kind of account of what the great saints do, suggesting that the will itself, in its full metaphysical form, is actually in torment with itself. The reason all the manifestations of will end up conflicted with one another is because there's something fundamental to the will, the thing in itself, in Kant's sense, the fundamental reality that accounts for everything we observe, that is internally conflicted. And so, in a sense, what the will wants is its own release or satisfaction. And according to Schopenhauer, it's the great saints that actually accomplish this. What they do is, through their intellect, allow their willfulness, the passion within them, to cease. It runs out of fuel, in effect, because it sees through the real folly of continuing to will and expecting any kind of peace to result from that. So what the saints do is, utilizing their intellect, silence the will. And attaining this kind of silence, according to Schopenhauer, is the fundamental goal of the will itself. So in a sense, what we have is the will manifesting itself through all of nature, through all the various creatures on the food chain, through the basic forces of nature, and ultimately through us. But the human will which has a connection to intellect, is the only form of manifestation that can escape the real crisis, the pain of willfulness. And so the great saint, in a sense, is fundamentally what nature is designed to produce. The human intellect that's capable of recognizing the truth about reality, that all is one, that no bit of everyday reality can gain at any other part's expense, and that therefore it's pointless to struggle. He concludes his book, in all of its editions, with a statement about the condition that the great saints achieve. For he points out that although the recommendation to renounce the will doesn't sound very desirable in most cases to most people, nevertheless, all the saints who have offered testimony through the ages have claimed that their choice is really blissful. And his explanation is as follows. We have to banish the dark impression of that nothingness, which as the final goal hovers behind all virtue and holiness, and which we fear as children fear darkness. On the contrary, we freely acknowledge that what remains after the complete abolition of the will is, for all who are still full of will, assuredly nothing. But also conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, this very world of ours, with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing. Thank you.